was delighted to find that the new IGP, almost as soon as he took office, had reinstituted the detective courses. He's also doing much more concerted training. Of course, in all fairness to the police, until this year, they had so many things to perform in a situation in which they were, understaffed and overstretched, that they couldn't really concentrate on things like training and development. With the conclusion of terrorism, I think we have to move on training. We've already had a couple of discussions on this. And I have to say that the senior level of the police are very, very positive about moving on to better training, to better professionalism, while recognizing that, of course, the ground situation for the last 20 years when you were fighting with terror meant that you couldn't do this. But I was really delighted. I mean, the new IGP said to us 2 things he had started before we even discussed it. Detective course, senior detective course, and strengthening women and children's desks all over, and especially in the north, because there are lots of single mothers and so on. Again, they're very sensitive when we are having discussion and talking about, restricting things. The policemen themselves said we also need to work with the schools, with the counsellors, because you must have a holistic, positive approach to abuse. You mustn't just say abuse is about saying, we have found an abuse and let's shout about it. It is about setting up a system that will prevent it, that will protect the vulnerable. So those are areas on which we are trying to work. We have actually formulated a draft Bill of Rights. This was one of the pledges of the Mahinda Chintanaya. A committee had been appointed about 4 years ago, but I found when I was secretary that it had not met for some time because they were very busy. These are high power. This is not a government committee. It's independent people from public, civil society and academics. So we asked them to really make a concerted effort and get it together, and they've given us a draft, and I think it's an excellent draft.
This is a draft Bill of Rights.
Draft Bill of Rights, as promised in the Mahinda Chintanaya of 2005. And the committee was set up some time ago, but we had to push them because they were not paid, they worked voluntarily, they've done a very good job. Then there's an action plan. And it's on terms of this action plan that we're working together with these 2 important ministries, the Human Rights Commission and the Ministry of Child Development and Women's Rights. And we were just discussing the other day systems in which we can move on developing community responses to limit abuses. But one of the other things I think we really have to say, and this we have, I think, recorded very well, is that the actual allegations of human rights abuses that can be followed up are minimal. For instance, I had this ridiculous situation where the Swedish ambassador in Geneva said, he was talking of the camps, and he said they're crowded. And we said, yes, you're right. And the government of Sri Lanka should release people as quickly as possible. I said, that is government policy. We also want to do it as quickly as possible. And then he said there are allegations of abuse by government forces of women and children. And I said, that's nonsense. Give me one example. He said, I have plenty of evidence. I said, send me the evidence, because I will look into it. We're committed to do that. He didn't send me any evidence. I had to send him 3 reminders before he finally sent me a letter saying, oh yes, we do have evidence, but I can't share with you because it's confidential. And I wrote back to him and saying, I'm not asking you to give me the source. I'm asking you to tell me when and where an abuse happened, and I will look into it. So there's a lot of myth-making which people engage in with no clear evidence. We are pledged to look into anything which we're told about. I found, for instance, there was some allegation and I said, have you discussed it? And they said, yes. Then the head of that institution said, I'm sorry, no, we didn't discuss it. So, a lot of lies goes on, but, if you follow up, you will find that there's very little concrete evidence. We do know, obviously, there has been some sexual abuse in the camps, but it's by the inmates. And this happens in any crowded society. It is our duty to limit it, not to use it to make allegations against the Sri Lankan government which are baseless.
Also, on that same note, Professor, you have also referred to this approach of sort of triumphalism when it comes to human rights problems, and you have also said many times that one needs to also focus on the positive developments of the government when grappling with human rights issues. What did you exactly mean by that?
Well, simply this, that, people sort of go around like Little Jack Horner saying, I found an abuse, look. And we've said, look, if there's an abuse, tell us, we'll go into it. For instance, one of the reasons we work well with some special rapporteurs is that Walter Cayley points out difficulties and says, but I think you should do A, B, C. And we say, we'll try and do A, B, but C we may not be able to do. And he listens. Manfred Novak, the man on torture, points out to us that there are cases of torture in Sri Lanka, and that is a fact. But he doesn't confuse it with the ethnic issue. You see, Philip Alston was almost trying to use these to tell us, stop fighting with the tigers. That we were not going to do. But if Manfred Novak tells us there are instances of torture, we will say, yes, we need to look into them. We also need to look into punishing them. One of the things we found was people say there's impunity. There's not impunity. We investigate, we prosecute. But sometimes we lose the case. You know, it's a bit like, I don't know whether the O.J. Simpson trial. He was acquitted of murder, but then found guilty of the same thing because the standards of proof were different. So, you know, when we have a situation where the Supreme Court has found against people on torture, but the Magistrates Court acquits, that is sheer evidence that Sri Lanka is not suppressing the case. Our Supreme Court has found against them. You can't blame us that the Magistrates Court acquits, because that's a matter for lawyers. But I was telling Dr. Mr. Valiamman, I said, instead of complaining, why don't you tell your lawyers not to defend people whom they think are criminal? But no lawyer is going to accept that.
And also you were insisting on the focusing on positive aspects. I think, for example, like in the IDP camps, even when the welfare centers were crowded, that the health ministry did a wonderful job to sort of ensure that there was no epidemic that's going to break out. So that's in the sort of, though it's a more economic and cultural rights and health aspect. So that's a positive development.
No, absolutely. Because I think what happens is sort of this diagnosis is all based on civil and political rights, which are important, but so are economic and social rights. And our people need to actually strengthen in that respect. You're very right to bring up the health issue. Because it's absolute nonsense. Every month they tell us there will be an epidemic. Then when there's no epidemic, they'll say there wasn't an epidemic this month, there will be an epidemic next month. Our health ministry did a fantastic job. Some of the problems in the camps are caused by the people who set them up, saying we must put up temporary camps and doing idiotic things like building toilets with plywood. But we actually told them they were wrong. When chaos started, what we actually did was we insisted on having a better drainage system, and fortunately the UN itself said, all right, they didn't say we have failed, but they accepted it. So our disaster management center was in charge. They did a superb job, monitored it carefully. They also told us what nonsense the highly paid shelter expert was. This is the man who did plywood toilets. And in fact the UN sent me a letter saying it was such a pleasure to work with the DMC, they were so efficient. So I think our people know perfectly well how to do it. We may not be the most brilliant in the world, but others are sometimes more inefficient. So I think we can feel very proud of our record in looking after our people, while always knowing that we must do better.
Right, and also, Professor, just one last question. Now, about the role of the NGOs and the INGOs in the social, economic and political environment in Sri Lanka. How do you see that?
Well, I think part of the problem with a lot of the NGOs was during the period up to about 3 years ago, they thought they held the balance between the Sri Lankan government and the LTT. You know, they came into this country thinking these are two equal forces. And they were not prepared to accept that these are an elected democratic government. Those were a bunch of terrorists. Unfortunately, they controlled a certain amount of territory. We couldn't get angry with these people for trying to help the people in there, but many of them compromised. None of them dared to say when the LTT was recruiting. Even the UN kept quiet about it. The LTT was recruiting one person per family. It was the Norwegian ambassador who told us formally. And I told the UN, you never mentioned this. So they, you know, what happened is they compromised endlessly with the LTT. And at one point when I told the UN had something, I said, why don't you talk? You criticize us all the time. He basically said, when you won't. Then I said, what you mean is we won't kill you, no? Else the LTT will kill you. So these people were cowards. They were absolute cowards. But I have to say that many of them tried to do a lot of good work. We must accept that. But a few of them are still under the impression that they are the guardians of the Sri Lankan people against the government. Just as they thought that they were the guardians of the Tamil people against the government, while they let the LTT exploit them. So I think that message has to be got clear, that, you know, this is an elected government. It has to look after its people. If you have a problem, come and tell us. But don't assume that you have to trumpet out aggressive nonsense about Sri Lanka in an attempt to shame the government to do what you want. The second fact we found is that many of them are not accountable. When there's something called the trap, I found they haven't given their accounts to the UN. You see, we thought the UN was keeping accounts. We find that the UN says, no, they don't give us the accounts because, you know, those things we have to stop. We have to make sure that any money that is given for the Sri Lankan people is used for the Sri Lankan people. Overheads and so on, we have to check. But having said that, many of them really are dedicated and hardworking, and we should work with them and make sure that their skills and resources are used to benefit people who need them.
So yes, we are speaking to Professor Rajiva Wijesinghe, Secretary of the Ministry of Disaster Management and Human Rights. So we just touched upon the corruption and human rights aspect, and he made a very interesting observation in both those areas, corruption and human rights. Corruption also, he said that the importance of finding concrete evidence, because that is the time you can also make a proper allegation. And the same with the human rights sector as well. To prosecute, you need concrete evidence. So he gave instances and examples in both these areas, corruption and human rights, how little concrete evidence is available when you're put forwarding that allegations. And that was a very interesting observation you made also, Professor. And also in the term, when talking about the developments of human rights, he also said that we as a country can be proud of how we have looked after people, but always remember that we can improve certain things with respect to human rights. With respect to the role of NGOs, Professor's analysis was that NGOs sort of always think that they are the guardians of the Sri Lankans, but also for them to understand that the government elect has that role to play, and their role